A man could eat your sins for a shilling. He would sit beside your corpse in the room where you'd just died. Someone would place bread across your chest, sometimes salt, sometimes a bowl of beer. He would eat it in total silence, then walk straight out the door. Your guilt was his now. He carried it so your soul wouldn't have to. Neighbors wouldn't shake his hand. Some wouldn't even say his name out loud. This wasn't a myth whispered in some forgotten corner of folklore. It was a documented, paid profession in parts of Britain into the 20th century. And it's not in a single mainstream history textbook. Most food history you learn in school follows the same 3 beats: agriculture, trade routes, a handful of famous spices. It's clean, it's tidy, it fits neatly onto a single timeline. But real food history is far messier than that, and much stranger. Buried underneath the polished version are stories about fear, status, deception, and power. Stories that got quietly left out because they don't flatter anyone currently in charge. Not the church, not the crown, not the companies that still sell us food today. Tonight, we're digging up 10 of them, one uncomfortable course at a time. Each one reveals something the official record would clearly rather forget. By the end, you'll understand why food history gets rewritten more than almost any other kind. Let's start with the sin eater, because it's the strangest job ever tied to a meal. In parts of Wales and rural England, funerals once required a very specific outsider. This person was poor, often homeless, and treated as barely respectable by anyone in town. Their job was to absorb the sins of the dead through the simple act of eating. Bread was passed over the corpse, sometimes salt, sometimes a cup of beer. The sin eater consumed it, and with it took on the deceased's entire spiritual burden. Villagers believed this act freed the dead person's soul for a peaceful afterlife. The sin eater, meanwhile, grew heavier with borrowed guilt every single time they ate. No church ever sanctioned this. Most priests actively condemned it as dangerous heresy. And yet, families kept hiring sin eaters anyway, generation after generation, for hundreds of years. One of the last recorded sin eaters, Richard Munslow, died in Shropshire in 1906. His grave still stands today, restored by locals who refused to let the story vanish. Historians have documented the practice as far back as the 1600s, possibly even earlier. It sat at the exact intersection of religion, poverty, and food, all at once. And because it involved neither kings nor empires, history books simply skipped right past it. There was no treaty to sign, no battle to date, nothing that fit a standard chapter. Just one poor stranger, a piece of bread, and a village desperate for spiritual peace. Now, travel back much further to a plant that no longer exists anywhere on Earth. It was called Silphium, and ancient Rome genuinely could not get enough of it. It flavored meat, it cured coughs, it reportedly worked as an early form of birth control. Silphium only grew wild in one narrow strip of land near modern-day Libya. It resisted every attempt at cultivation. Farmers tried transplanting it elsewhere and always failed. That scarcity made it worth more than its weight in silver, sometimes more than gold. Roman coins were minted with its image, stamped right beside the emperor's own face. Demand kept climbing decade after decade. Supply, tied to one patch of coastline, never could. Julius Caesar reportedly stockpiled over 1,000 pounds of it inside the Roman treasury. By the 1st century AD, Silphium had vanished almost entirely from the historical record. The Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder wrote that only a single stalk was ever found again. That stalk, the story goes, was presented to Emperor Nero as a rare curiosity. Then it simply disappeared, and no confirmed Silphium plant has ever been found since. The Roman Empire, by most modern accounts, had eaten a plant into total extinction. It stands as one of the earliest documented cases of humans destroying their own food source. Most textbooks proudly mention Rome's roads and aqueducts. Almost none mention the spice it erased. It's a quiet warning dressed up as ancient trivia. Even an empire can outpace what the earth provides. Here's a phrase you've probably used yourself without ever knowing its likely origin. Eating humble pie sounds like a harmless old expression for swallowing your pride. The most widely cited explanation traces it to umbles, the organs of a deer. After a medieval hunt, the lord and his guests kept the prized venison meat. Servants and lower-ranking members of the household got the umbles instead, baked into a pie. The dish literally split a household by rank, right there on the dinner table. Eat venison and you were powerful. Eat umble pie and everyone at the table knew your place. Over centuries, umble pie is believed to have slurred into humble pie in everyday speech. Some etymologists debate the exact link, but the class divide behind the dish is well documented. Either way, we still say it today. Unaware, we may be quoting a medieval hierarchy of who mattered. Here's another stranger thread. Testicles served as a delicacy across wildly different cultures worldwide. Ancient Greek athletes reportedly ate bull testicles before competition, chasing strength and raw virility. Roman gladiators followed similar rituals before ever stepping foot into the arena. Centuries later, American ranch hands turned the very same ingredient into Rocky Mountain oysters. Across Aztec, Andean, and parts of Central Asian cuisine, remarkably similar dishes appear independently. The specific belief varied slightly by culture, but the underlying pattern never really changed. Eating the organ, people believed, transferred its power directly to whoever ate it. This idea is called sympathetic magic, and it quietly shaped diets for thousands of years. It's not a footnote buried in an appendix. It's a thread running through nearly every ancient civilization. Traditional Chinese medicine built similar organ transfer beliefs into its own approach to food and healing. The specific animal changed by region. The core logic behind eating it barely moved at all. Modern superfood marketing still leans on a softer version of that exact same instinct today. Eat the right thing, the pitch goes, and some part of its power becomes yours. Yet you won't find this pattern mentioned in a single mainstream world history curriculum. Now for something that may have quietly reshaped the fate of an entire empire. Wealthy Romans loved a sweetener called Sapa, boiled down slowly from unfermented grape juice. They often boiled it inside lead pots because lead resisted corrosion better than other metals. That slow boiling process pulled lead acetate directly out of the metal and into the syrup. Lead acetate happens to taste distinctly sweet, which only encouraged Romans to use even more. Roman elites poured Sapa into wine, into sauces, and into preserved fruit almost constantly. Some historians have proposed this habit contributed to lead poisoning among the Roman upper class. Symptoms of that kind of poisoning include irritability, infertility, and slow cognitive decline over years. To be clear, this theory remains genuinely debated among historians, not settled, established fact. Many argue that politics, disease, and invasion mattered far more in Rome's eventual decline. But the physical evidence of elevated lead exposure in Roman skeletal remains is very real. Modern isotope studies of Roman-era bones have found lead levels far above pre-industrial baselines. An empire may have spent centuries slowly poisoning its own leadership, one sweet cup at a time. And the people drinking the most Sapa were, ironically, the ones who could actually afford it. Poverty, for once in this story, may have accidentally protected people from real harm. Wealth, meanwhile, quietly poisoned the very people it was supposed to reward and protect. Move forward now to medieval Europe, where food stopped being just food entirely. At royal banquets, dishes became political theater, engineered specifically to display raw power. The most famous example was called a Cockentrice, a stitched-together fantasy creature of a dish. Cooks sewed the front half of a pig directly onto the back half of a capon. Sometimes they combined a peacock's skin with a completely different roasted bird hidden underneath. These dishes were officially called subtleties, and they were never meant to simply be eaten. Some were built specifically to release live birds the moment the crust was cut open. Guests would gasp as startled, terrified birds burst out across the crowded banquet hall. This wasn't cooking in any ordinary sense. It was propaganda, engineered to prove wealth and control. The message underneath every subtlety was simple: this house can bend nature to its will. Kings used these dishes to intimidate rival nobles just as much as to feed them. One famous subtlety reportedly depicted an entire castle under siege, built entirely from pastry. Building one could take a team of cooks several full days of continuous work. A single subtlety might be paraded through the hall, admired, then barely tasted by anyone. That was never a failure. Being seen mattered more than being eaten. Textbooks cover medieval castles in exhaustive detail. They almost never cover what happened at the table inside them. For centuries, silver and gold weren't just currency. They were occasionally served on a plate. Wealthy Persian, Mughal, and later European diners sometimes ate food wrapped in real, edible gold leaf. It had no flavor and no nutritional value whatsoever. That was never really the point. The point was watching a guest chew and swallow pure, visible wealth in front of everyone. Some royal feasts reportedly gilded entire roasted birds before they ever reached the table. It's the same impulse as the cockentrice, just measured in ounces of precious metal instead. Before we go further, let's correct one myth almost everyone repeats as established fact. You've likely heard that Romans built special rooms called vomitoriums just for purging mid-feast. The idea is that gluttonous elites would eat, vomit, then return to eat even more. It's a vivid image. It shows up in movies, novels, and countless casual conversations. It's also, according to classical historians, simply not true at all. A vomitorium was an architectural term for a passageway, usually inside an amphitheater or stadium. The name comes from vomere, meaning to spew forth, but it described people, not vomit. Crowds would vomit out quickly through these wide exits after a show ended. No credible ancient source ever describes a dedicated feast vomiting room anywhere in Rome. Yet this false version has been repeated so often, it now feels like settled history. It's a reminder that even our confident facts about ancient food culture can be pure invention. Now, here's a myth that most people still repeat, and it needs a serious correction. You've probably heard that Europeans once believed tomatoes were poisonous and simply refused to eat them. That part is true. Tomatoes belong to the nightshade family, alongside genuinely toxic plants. 16th century Europeans saw the resemblance and, understandably, assumed the worst about this new arrival. But there's a second layer to this story that rarely makes it into the retelling. Wealthy Europeans ate off pewter plates, which contained a significant amount of lead. Tomatoes are highly acidic, and that acid slowly leached lead directly out of the pewter. Diners who ate tomatoes off pewter sometimes did fall seriously ill, or worse, afterward. Poorer households, eating off simple wooden plates, never experienced this same reaction at all. So the fear wasn't entirely irrational. It was a real, measurable danger, just misdiagnosed completely. Historians still debate exactly how large a role this specific effect played in the wider myth. But it shows how a documented reaction and pure folklore can blend into a single, tidy story. Finally, consider a moldy grain that may have quietly triggered outright panic across entire towns. Rye bread, a dietary staple across medieval Europe, was vulnerable to a fungus called ergot. In damp years, ergot-infected grain made its way into flour and then into daily bread. Ergot contains compounds chemically related to LSD, and eating enough of it causes real hallucinations. Victims reported burning limbs, violent convulsions, and vivid, terrifying visions after eating tainted bread. Communities called the affliction St. Anthony's fire, having no scientific concept of fungal poisoning yet. Some historians have proposed ergot poisoning as a partial explanation for certain historical mass panics. The 1692 Salem witch trials are the most famous example researchers have connected to this theory. That specific link remains genuinely controversial, and most historians consider it unproven at best. What isn't controversial is this: ordinary bread quietly caused real convulsions across entire villages for centuries. Entire outbreaks were blamed on curses, demons, and witchcraft instead of a damp harvest. And almost nobody realized the danger was baked into their own daily loaf. So here's the turning point in this whole story, and it changes everything you've just heard. It's tempting to assume all of this belongs safely in the distant, superstitious past. Sin-eaters, Silphium, lead-sweetened wine. Surely modern food left danger and superstition behind for good. It didn't. It simply changed shape, and it got far more deliberate along the way. In Victorian Britain, food adulteration became a widespread, calculated, profit-driven industrial practice overnight. Bakers added chalk and alum to bread, stretching the flour and whitening the loaf artificially. Tea sellers padded used, dried-out leaves with thorn leaves, then dyed the mixture bright green. Candy makers colored sweets using lead chromate, a pigment now firmly known to be toxic. Pickle producers added copper sulfate specifically to make ordinary vegetables look vividly, unnaturally green. None of this was folk superstition passed down through generations. It was calculated and it was profitable. Chemist Frederick Occam published detailed exposés naming specific offending brands back in 1820. He was largely ignored by the public and actively threatened by furious food producers for doing it. Real legal regulation didn't actually arrive in Britain until decades after his original warnings. Some historians estimate that adulterated food sickened and, in some cases, killed thousands of Victorian children. The ancient world feared curses hidden inside its food. The industrial world hid real poison in it on purpose. That's the uncomfortable shift most textbooks tend to gloss right over in a single sentence. So, why does any of this actually matter to you right now, today? Because food history isn't some quirky sidebar to the real history of kings and wars. It's a direct, physical record of who held power and who quietly paid the price for it. The Sin Eater reveals how deep poverty forced people into spiritually dangerous, deeply low-status work. Silphium reveals exactly how far humans will push a resource before it simply disappears forever. Humble Pie reveals how a single dish could quietly enforce an entire social hierarchy. Sapa reveals how comfort itself can slowly poison the very people enjoying it most. The Cockentrice and the gilded bird reveal food as a weapon of status and fear. The tomato myth reveals how real danger and pure folklore can fuse into one story. Ergot reveals how an entire community can suffer from a threat nobody can even name yet. Victorian adulteration reveals how profit can override public safety, given even the smallest opportunity. None of these are dusty relics locked safely behind glass in some museum somewhere. Every single pattern described tonight still exists in some form inside today's food system. Modern additive scandals, natural flavor labeling loopholes, and murky supply chains trace back to these same roots. We still hide uncomfortable truths behind whatever happens to be sitting on the plate in front of us. The Vomitorium myth reveals something quieter, but just as important about history itself. Sometimes it's not power hiding the truth. Sometimes it's just a story too good to correct. Both kinds of distortion end up in the same place, a version of the past that's easier to swallow. So the next time a textbook hands you a clean timeline of trade routes and treaties, ask a different question. Ask what got quietly left out of the chapter and who benefited from that silence. Ask who was hungry, who was poisoned, and who profited quietly somewhere in between. The real history of food was never simply about what people chose to eat. It was always about what they feared, what they hid, and who they ultimately blamed. That story didn't end with the Romans, and it didn't end with the Victorians either. It didn't end with sin-eaters or gilded birds or a spice pressed onto Roman coins. It's still being written today, one overlooked ingredient at a time, on every single plate. Somewhere, right now, a label is leaving something out, quietly, on purpose.